McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, welcome to the program. I'm Dennis McCuistion, and sitting next to me is my co-host, Jim Falk. Jim, welcome back to the program.
Always good to be here with you, and this certainly is a timely topic.
Well, you think impeachment isn't timely? I can't imagine why you say that, but perhaps it is. Perhaps it is. You know, impeachment of a president is fortunately very rare, but the subject is on the minds, as Jim said, of most Americans today. But what do the founders mean when they listed treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors? You're about to find out as we look at previous impeachment inquiries and examine the politics and process of impeachment. So let's meet our experts. First on my right is Matt Wilson. He's Associate Professor of Political Science at SMU, where his focus is on elections, public opinion, religion, and politics. I want to congratulate you for getting all that together, Matt. I really do. And sitting next to you, Jim Riddlesberger. He's Professor of Political Science at TCU and the author of 9 books, including one on Texas politics. So, Jim, welcome to the program.
Delighted to be here.
While we are talking about this on a current basis, the real fact of the matter is that I think the average person, including probably the two of us, doesn't really know what the historical perspective is. Take us back to the beginning. What does the Constitution say about this thing? What about this process that we're talking about here?
Okay. Well, I'll try to be brief because, as you know, much has been written about this over the years. So if you ask political scientists to go into this kind of a question, we often will wander off into the weeds, and I'd rather stay in the center of the idea. The bottom line is that the framers of the Constitution were scared of executive power. They were scared of a demagogue president, and they were scared of a tyrant. Those are the words that you hear them writing, if you hear through writing, over and over again. And so they wanted to have a check against a too powerful president, a president that ignored the constraints of the Constitution. And James Madison at first only envisioned it to be the first 2 charges, treason and bribery. And what they had in mind, of course, at that time was the case of Benedict Arnold during the Revolutionary War, which was kind of the only example that they had of that kind of treasonous behavior. And it was George Mason from Virginia that said, oh, no, we need a more general check on the president. And he was the one that added the or other high crimes and misdemeanors, which comes from British history, and it means crimes that are committed by the sovereign. In other words, a high crime can only be committed by someone in executive authority, and therefore it is not a crime in the sense that we think of a violation of the criminal code. It's a violation of the constitutional constraints of the president, and that was the idea that they had, but they wanted a very broad power to constrain the president, because remember, Article 1 of the Constitution is the congressional article. All of the powers of the national government are listed in Article 1, Section 8. The framers didn't like executive authority, and they wanted to constrain it to the best degree that they possibly could. And that's the origin of impeachment. Now, the process is a 2-staged process.
But before you get there, let me just interject and ask, James Madison and others were particularly concerned about foreign influence, weren't they?
That is correct. And that makes this case, the case of President Trump right now, far more typical of what the framers thought would be issues of impeachment than any of the prior ones that had to do with domestic politics.
Because we were a new republic, and they were understandably concerned what Great Britain England might try to do.
Or other international powers, of course. Yeah. So the process has 2 stages to it. Impeachment is actually only the bringing of charges, and it is done by the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives determines if there are sufficient grounds to bring charges against the president. And if they do that, that is called impeachment. If the House of Representatives votes for impeachment articles, that never happened in the case of Richard Nixon, for example. Nixon resigned before there was a vote in the House. The only two presidents who have been impeached have been Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Then, once those charges, those impeachment charges come forward, then the second stage of the process is to hold a trial in the United States Senate. And in that trial, the Chief Justice of the United States will be the presiding entity, and the senators will act as the jury.
So the articles are essentially an indictment. Is that right?
The articles of impeachment are, well, if we were to compare them to a criminal charge, and again, I think that's appropriate, but it's not the same thing, because this doesn't have to do with anything other than removing a president from power. It doesn't have to do with going to prison or paying fine or anything of the sort. It's just removing the president from power. And by the way, at the time of the writing of the Constitution, you understand that most of the framers thought that the vice president would probably be the president's chief opponent. So there was no notion that if the president was removed, that another member of his own political party would become president. They understood that it would go to probably the leader of the opposition, which would have been a much more likely outcome under the original Electoral College.
And am I right that this was one of the most hotly discussed items at the Constitution? It was very hard for them to agree.
It was, but everything having to do with presidential power and the limitations on presidential power was a hot topic at the Constitutional Convention.
Mm-hmm. And Matt, given what he's just said, I think even though our viewers are smarter than any other television viewer, we know that, we got that. The average person on the street, it seems to me, doesn't understand at least the second half of what he's talking about here. They just see impeachment, the process that goes on right now, as something that can remove somebody from office. What do we need to understand about it on a day-to-day basis? And give us those examples of Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton would be good examples.
Sure. So impeachment is something that is done strictly by the House of Representatives, can be done by a majority vote, and it is a statement by the House that they believe that the president has engaged in serious misconduct. That does not remove the president from office. That would have to be done by the Senate, who, based on an impeachment that's been done by the House, conducts a trial, and if 2/3 of the senators agree, can remove the president from office. That has never been done. Both in Andrew Johnson's case and in Bill Clinton's case, a majority of the House of Representatives voted to impeach them, that is, to accuse them of serious misconduct, but the Senate fell short of the 2/3 that would have been required.
How close was the vote with Johnson?
Johnson was saved by a single vote. Bill Clinton was around 50 votes for impeachment. It was about a 50-50 proposition, well short of the 2/3 that would have been required to remove him from office.
But one of the things about this, it seems, at least especially now, it really becomes partisan. And when you have a Senate that is essentially equal, or now we have, 53 Republicans, and that's why with the Trump situation, which we don't know what's going to happen when the show is aired, but we assume at this point that it's going to be a partisan vote.
Yes, it's likely to be a partisan vote in the House. It's likely to be a partisan vote in the Senate as well. One of the things that's worth noting historically is that the reason that Richard Nixon resigned before this process could play out is that Republicans in the Senate came to him and said, we can no longer support you, Mr. President. And so it became clear that a significant number of members of his own party were willing to vote to remove him from office, at which point he decided to resign before that could play itself out. In the Clinton case, you never had a significant number of Democrats jumping ship from Bill Clinton. And thus far, in President Trump's case, you have not had any significant number of...
A lot of people would say that the Democrats always stick together, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, whereas the Republicans, well, the unorganized party or whatever it may be, don't do that. But it seems to me that if your particular area of expertise, there's one other factor other than partisanship, and that's the public opinion. How important is public opinion in the past, and how important is public opinion today in your estimation?
Because essentially it is a political mechanism, not illegal, right?
That's right. It's a political process, and of course the people who are the jury that is the members of the United States Senate, are ultimately responsible to the voters. That is, they have to face re-election. So how they vote, I mean, certainly how members of the House vote, but particularly then also how senators vote, can affect their own political career and their own trajectory here. What troubles me about this from a public opinion standpoint is that increasingly this is becoming, impeachment in general, is becoming a partisan question not only for the people on Capitol Hill, but for the people out in the mass public as well. If we look at public opinion polls right now, essentially we're down to a case where virtually everyone who supported Donald Trump opposes his impeachment, and virtually everyone who opposed Donald Trump supports his impeachment.
Well, the other thing, too, is impeachment by the Founding Fathers was to be used only in extraordinary circumstances. And certainly in the last several administrations, impeachment has been discussed. It never reached the point it has now with the Trump administration. But certainly people talked about impeaching George W. Bush and President Barack Obama.
And of course, Bill Clinton was impeached.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the truth is that there have been bills of impeachment introduced for against almost every president in the history of the United States. We are in a particularly polarized time in American political history, but even if you look back at the impeachments of Andrew Johnson or Bill Clinton, you find high degrees of partisanship involved in that whole process as well. What made the Nixon case different was that there were significant numbers of Republicans that did abandon him. Most importantly, Barry Goldwater, the conservative senator from Arizona. And I want to quibble a little bit with your suggestion that somehow the Republicans are not as united as the Democrats. The truth is, historically, over the last 30 years, the Republicans are more united than the Democrats on issues like this. But neither party now has almost any wiggle room at all. Both parties are incredibly united.
Jim, I want to go back to the process because there's still an area where I'm not clear on, and that is the role of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Well, this is one of the things, and we were talking about this before we went on air. The Constitution is very vague on the process of impeachment. And so one of the things we're hearing now are criticisms of the process of impeachment in the House. I'm sure that we would see criticisms were this impeachment to happen and a trial to take place in the Senate. And then we would have questions about what the Chief Justice's role would be presiding over the trial. The Constitution does not give us guidance in that regard. So the Senate would make rules about how the process would play out and probably would do so in a very similar way to the Clinton impeachment trial because that's—
But they're not obligated to do so.
That is correct. Nor, for example, is the House required to have articles of impeachment handed down by the Judiciary Committee. But they've always done it that way, and so they did it that way again this year. So all of this stuff is in play, and as an impeachment trial came forward, both the timing of the trial and the process of the trial would be subject to Senate rules, and one would think that Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, would have a heavy role in determining what those rules would be.
And another thing that should be stressed, I think, is that the Founding Fathers did not want the president removed for ineptitude. It really had to be high crimes and misdemeanors.
Right. They certainly did not want a president to be removed because of policy disagreement or because of the perception that he was not performing his job well. There's a separate mechanism if the president truly becomes incapacitated.
Right, the 25th Amendment.
Right. So that exists. That's been created.
Relatively recently.
Right. But you're right that the impeachment provisions are there for clear cases of serious wrongdoing.
But impeachment is such a draconian measure, and I suspect you've read Ken Starr's book that came out last year about, it was called Contempt, and it was his retrospective on the Clinton situation. And at the end, he recommends that perhaps short of impeachment, they should have censured President Bill Clinton.
I think that that's an avenue that if we had a little bit of bipartisanship in the nation's capital today, that might have been pursued in even this year. But we don't have that. And so while it sounds like a kind of reasonable half step, the possibility for it is, I think, almost impossible at this point.
But the thing is, Jim, that if I were in President Trump's camp, then I would be saying, you guys, tried to impeach him before he even took the oath of office. And then you had one, let's just say, elected representative in the election of 2018, whose name I won't mention, but let's just say she made a statement that had a word that's not possible to use even on PBS about impeaching him. So I guess.
But we saw this in 2008. We saw it in 2012 with President Obama, too.
Yeah, we did, but I'm not sure we saw it to this extent back in that day.
Well,
I'm not sure we saw it to the extent.
I think we're becoming more vile in our polarization.
And social
has
media.
Impeachment, so has a call for impeachment become normal, I guess, a normalization of a process that regardless of who's elected, the other side wants to impeach the person?
I think that I would say it's less abnormal than it was before. I still think that it's not normal. But clearly, the American public has not paid as much attention to this impeachment as they did to the Clinton one, and not nearly as much to the Clinton one as they did to the Nixon one. And perhaps because of the fact that it just seems to be less unusual now than it was before. But again, if we get back to the reality, and I know I love to quote Gerald Ford on this. Of course, Gerald Ford wanted to use the impeachment power against a liberal member of the Supreme Court, William O. Douglas, for reasons that aren't really important. And in justifying his proposal to impeach Douglas, he said that an impeachable offense is anything Congress says that it is. And the unfortunate reality is that's the best definition I can come up with. That is in fact the case. If you can get a majority in the House of Representatives to say that it's an impeachable offense, then it is. And if you can get 2/3 of the senators to say that you should be removed, then you are. And while the constitutional requirements obviously give us guidance in that regard, we know how those terms can be twisted and manipulated by people who are practitioners.
Well, we talk about the equal branches of government. This is certainly an instance where they're not equal because the legislative branch has power over the executive.
Yeah, that is, the legislative branch's authority in this respect is absolute. That is, if the Senate votes to remove the president from office, there's no recourse. That is, that decision cannot be overturned by the Supreme Court. That is not subject to a veto, obviously a presidential veto. It is an absolute and final decision.
On the other hand, we say it's a congressional power, but what are we into 200 and how many ever years, and we haven't ever had a president removed through the impeachment process, with the possible exception of President Nixon, who chose to resign.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no doubt in your mind that he would have been impeached and convicted and removed from office?
Well, the answer is probably. But of course, we can't prove something that we don't have evidence of.
Well, if in fact we sit here and try to figure out what a high crime and misdemeanor is, would having a somewhat loose Twitter account fit that definition, Matt?
I would think not, unless you were using it to betray national security secrets, or something that touched on treason or bribery. There's a reason why the Democrats in the House have made a real point of referring repeatedly to bribery in describing President Trump's behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine, and it's because bribery is specifically mentioned in the Constitution as one of the things that would merit impeachment.
And the infamous phrase quid pro quo is not.
Right, the phrase quid pro quo is not. Loose Twitter account would not seem to suffice. The other thing that's important in terms of understanding that phrase, high crimes and misdemeanors, it's important to understand that in an 18th century context, not in a 21st century context. When we talk today about misdemeanors, that implies crimes that are not very serious. That's not what the founders meant. Misdemeanor simply meant misbehavior or misconduct. So they're talking about high crime or high misconduct, serious crimes or misconduct.
Now
That could only be done by the sovereign. Right. I mean, it would. So it's not necessarily related to the criminal law at all. It's misconduct by someone in high positions of power.
Back to the rules. Can the Senate successfully call witnesses and impose them to come? Just like what happened in civil or criminal court.
Congress does have subpoena power, so Congress can issue a subpoena. Now, presumably, a person could challenge that in the same way that anyone who is subpoenaed
and then it would go through the court system.
The subpoena, exactly. But they do have that power.
And given the way that this process has unfolded so far, it's quite possible that some of the fact witnesses that really have been present at some of the conversations that we've been discussing will simply refuse to participate.
Both of you are political scientists and have studied this so carefully. Are there ways that you think that perhaps the process could be changed or should be changed? I'm sure it would never get through a constitutional amendment, but just hypothetically.
Well, I mean, I think the big way that it might change is the fact that the Constitution is so vague in this regard. So the impeachment process
But purposely so.
Yes, it is. And the impeachment process is designed and used by Congress, and Congress has the power to design how it moves forward. And so, you know, this is just, we don't know, in fact, what a trial of President Trump would look like because the Senate has not yet made its rules about how we would proceed. Our best guess is they would use a similar procedure to the one that they used for President Clinton, but that's just a guess.
Well, and in the Electoral College programs that we did previously, the idea, and I think you brought it up, Jim, the idea of not so much foreign interference, but the whole idea of a foreign connection, interference in terms of Russia. Was it Ukraine? Was it whomever? I mean, how important do you think, putting partisanship aside now, how important do you think an impeachment process is if it is, let's say, purely domestic, which I don't know what I'm not sure what the word is means, or she and I didn't have sex.
Don't go there.
Whatever it is.
Moving on.
That's what I call a local affair. Versus foreign affairs. Is foreign affairs, in your estimation, more likely to rise to this level that we're talking about?
I mean, more likely, maybe, but it wouldn't necessarily have to involve that. I mean, think back to the Nixon case. The Nixon case was a domestic. It was a burglary of the opposition party's headquarters. So that's not a foreign issue, and yet that's the one case that would likely have actually resulted in the president being removed from office. The Andrew Johnson case was not a foreign issue. The Bill Clinton case was not a foreign issue. The Trump situation is actually the first time that we've seen a push for presidential impeachment that does involve a foreign connection.
Because with Johnson and Nixon, it was really abuse of power.
That's right, alleged. Well, in Johnson's case, kind of a tenuous claim about abuse of power. In Nixon's case, a pretty clear case of connection to actual criminality.
Right.
And then in
Bill
Clinton's
Clinton was
case,
perjury.
Yes, it was perjury, which would have been an illegal act by the President of the United States.
Well, let me give me I'm going to give you a hypothetical here. Let's assume that there was a pretty good chance that FDR basically knew Pearl Harbor was going to be bombed and let it be bombed anyway. Would that be a high crime and misdemeanor?
Well, that would be construable as treason.
I think that would be, treason.
Treason?
Just like, there's evidence now that President Nixon took efforts to try to keep Vietnam going during the '68 campaign. Mm-hmm. I think those kinds of things would be treasonous and certainly would be impeachable offenses.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Today is a little less cut and dried than that, obviously, but we have a transcript. The transcript must be read like it's supposed to be read. Or do you think there's any politics involved in this process?
Well, of course there's politics involved.
But also, again,
and,
that's really not a transcript. People have been misusing that word.
Well, sort of a transcript.
It's a transcript of that someone transcribed while they were listening to the conversation, but it's certainly not a transcript of the conversation. Right. The reality is that I think even Republicans wish that President Trump had not said things the way that he said things in that conversation. The big question is, does it rise to the level of being an impeachable offense? And the Democrats think that it is an absolute dead case of, I will not give you your money until you investigate my political opponent. And the Republicans say there's no evidence that the Ukrainians knew that there was that kind of an offer, that they knew it was required, and ultimately the money was released what's the big deal? And so what we have here is two completely different narratives about what that conversation was about.
But essentially, those are talking points for each party.
Correct.
Sure. And the other critical question that's in play here is whether a desire to have Ukraine investigate corruption, including with Burisma, which is the company that Hunter Biden was involved with, whether there was any legitimate American national interest in having that corruption investigation take place, or whether this was simply something intended to benefit President Trump personally and politically. If there was a legitimate American national interest in having these investigations take place, then you might say, oh, well, the president's perfectly legitimate. It's perfectly legitimate for the president to ask Ukraine to undertake these investigations.
You know,
if it simply serves him personally and politically, then you would say, well, this is a misuse of the powers of office for personal benefit.
Because it's become so partisan, I almost get the feeling that I wish it could be a grand jury, where you would bring in independent people to hear the sides and make a determination.
Well, I mean, essentially, that's the House is functioning as a grand jury right now.
Well, it's functioning as but a very partisan grand jury.
It's a political process.
I think that was the name of the program: impeachment, the
Process.
politics, and the process.
Yep.
And you can't, unfortunately, separate.
And I think the politics is uppercase.
I think, well, that's exactly right. But we appreciate the two of you being on here and letting that viewer know exactly what the process is. Because if nothing else, we want them to understand that it's a two-part process here, and that those things both have to happen. Thank you both for all you're doing and all that. And Jim, it's always a pleasure being here with you to talk about little lighthearted issues like impeachment. What the heck? So,
Well, I'm glad you guys were with us. Thank you.
while this program was not meant to apply to today's situation, and while today's situation may be resolved by the time you see this program, we hope that your understanding of the politics and the process is a more educated one. Watch other programs on this and similar topics at McCuistionTV.com. And don't neglect to invite us in to talk about things that matter with people who care. We promise you we won't be too political about it. Thank you.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at NikkiMcCuistion.com. Visit our website at www.McCuistionTV.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McCuistionTV or download McCuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.